Caleb Rowan found the woman by his fence after the snow had buried the road, her lips nearly colorless and her coat far too thin for a Montana blizzard. She gave no name, offered no explanation, only asked to stand near a heat source until morning. The single father let her in, gave her dry clothes and the spare bedroom, and asked nothing. But when dawn touched the ridge above Silver Creek, rotor blades tore apart the silence. A black helicopter settled in the field out front. 6 figures in dark coats stepped out, and the man in front called her by 2 words that stopped Caleb cold. Madam CEO. If you believe kindness doesn't need a name to act, stay with us and discover what that helicopter was really carrying. The storm hit Silver Creek on a Tuesday evening, arriving 2 weeks ahead of the Weather Service's forecast, and burying the county road under 8 inches of fresh powder before most ranchers had finished dinner. Caleb Rowan had been out since 4 in the afternoon, fixing a failed generator on the Hartley property 3 miles east on a ridge where the wind came in sideways, and the temperature dropped another 12 degrees after dark. He was 40 years old, built lean from a decade of hauling equipment up mountain switchbacks, and he made his living keeping the electrical systems of remote farms alive through winters that had no patience for human error. His truck rolled past the outer fence line at 8:30, headlights cutting a pale tunnel through the falling white, and that was when he saw the shape that did not belong. A woman standing barely upright near the wooden post at the corner of his property, one arm looped over the top rail, wearing a coat cut for a city boardroom and shoes built for polished floors, not packed snow. Caleb stopped the truck, left the engine running and the heater on, and walked toward her with the measured calm of someone who had learned long ago that approaching a stranger in distress too quickly usually made things worse. He asked her if she was hurt, and she said not in the way he meant. He asked where her vehicle was, and she said it had gone down in a valley further east, that there had been a mechanical failure, that she had walked a long time before the cold made further walking impossible. She did not say the word helicopter, and Caleb noticed the deliberate pause before the word mechanical, the slight recalibration of her phrasing, as though she had selected a term that was accurate enough without being precise. He put his spare work coat around her shoulders, walked her to the passenger side of the truck, and drove the remaining 200 yards to the house without asking anything more until she was sitting in front of the wood stove with a wool blanket pulled across her lap. He heated soup from a pot he had left simmering on the back burner and set it on the table beside her without ceremony, the way a man does something he considers obvious rather than generous. The house was small and exact. Tools hung on pegboards in the back hall, a calendar with hand-marked service dates fixed to the kitchen wall, and on the shelf near the staircase a photograph of Caleb beside a teenage boy who had his father's eyes and a grin that had not yet learned restraint. She looked at the photo for a moment, then looked away, and Caleb caught the look and understood that she had registered what it meant. That he was alone here, and that whatever else he was someone who had learned to run a household without a second hand. He tried the emergency line once, got static layered over static, and switched off the radio. She asked him, quietly, but with a precision that did not match the trembling still working through her hands, not to broadcast her location on any shared emergency channel. Caleb set the handset down and looked at her for a long moment, with the flat, patient attention of a man who preferred reading situations to reacting to them, noting the way she held the mug with both hands and kept her weight angled slightly toward the door, even while she was sitting, the posture of someone who had not fully decided yet that this room was safe. He said he would not call it in tonight, but made no promise about the morning, and she nodded in the way of someone who had decided that was the best available arrangement. He showed her to the spare bedroom and turned to go. Something slipped from the inner pocket of the coat he had lent her and landed on the floor between them. A small matte black metal card, its surface bearing a pressed insignia of two stylized wings and a line of text that Caleb read before he thought to look away. Kingsley Aeronautics, Executive Access. He picked it up, placed it on the dresser without comment, and pulled the door shut behind him. The storm pressed against the windows all night with a low, sustained sound like something breathing, and the house held its warmth the way old wood houses do, imperfectly, stubbornly, well enough. Caleb built up the fire before turning in, checked both exterior doors, and sat for a while at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the metal card placed face down in front of him. Kingsley Aeronautics was not a name that required explanation in any conversation touching aviation or defense procurement. It was the sort of company that appeared in Senate hearings and financial headlines, where a single division's revenue exceeded the GDP of several small nations, and where the surname carried authority that had long since stopped needing to announce itself. He turned the card over once, put it face down again, and went to bed because she was either exactly what the card suggested or something more complicated still, and neither answer changed what had needed to be done in the previous 2 hours. In the morning, she was already up when he came downstairs, sitting at the table with her hands around a mug she had made herself, wearing the old green sweater he had left, folded on the dresser, the one that had belonged to his wife, which he kept in the guest room because it was too warm to throw out and too much to look at from across the hall. She asked if she could pay for the room, the food, and the clothes, and her voice had recovered something of its original register. A composure that came not from confidence exactly, but from long practice. Caleb said no one should be left in the cold because they hadn't had time to prepare cash, and the simplicity of the answer seemed to land on her sideways, her expression moving through something between suspicion and recalibration, the face of someone trying to identify a category for a transaction that had not followed the expected structure. He asked her, with no particular emphasis, whether she worked for Kingsley Aeronautics, and she said she was a management employee, that she handled logistics, and he let the vagueness stand without noting it aloud, because the point was not what she said but what she had already shown him. Her phone caught a signal for roughly 40 seconds just after 8 in the morning, long enough for a cascade of missed notifications to fill the screen, names he couldn't read from across the table, but enough of them to make her face go carefully still. She moved to the far window and checked her messages with her back to him, and he refilled his coffee and did not watch. What she saw in those 40 seconds changed something in her posture, tightening it not with fear exactly, but with the particular alertness of someone who has just received confirmation of a thing they had been hoping was not true. A single message sat among the other notifications, its sender obscured, and it read, "Stay where you are. Do not trust the recovery team." She read it twice, and then the signal dropped and the message disappeared from her screen as though it had never existed, deleted remotely by whoever had written it, and she put the phone in her pocket and turned back into the room. He was looking at her with the same steady, unhurried attention he had given her the night before, and she said he was very good at not asking questions, and he said it was less a skill than a conclusion, that answers came faster when the person holding them didn't feel cornered. That evening, she asked why he had let a stranger through his door, and his answer came without hesitation. He hadn't needed to trust her to know she would have been dead by morning if he hadn't, and the particular directness of it left her with nothing to add. She looked at the green sweater she was wearing, and something in her expression shifted in a way that had nothing to do with the current room, a private accounting she kept interior. And through the far window, a beam of light swept slowly across the tree line, steady, methodical, the movement of something searching rather than something lost. Caleb was at the window in 12 seconds. The main room lights already dark because he had hit the switch the moment the beam appeared, moving through the hallway with the economy of motion that came from years in a job where slow reactions had consequences. An unmarked SUV sat on the county road 200 yards out, engine idling, no emergency markings, no roof rack, and two figures were moving along the tree line with handheld lights, checking the ground in the systematic pattern of a search rather than a rescue. Legitimate search and rescue teams in Montana were required to carry illuminated identification panels and establish radio contact before approaching private property after dark, and the people in the field were doing neither. He told Evelyn to step away from the windows and move to the interior wall, and she did so without hesitation, the movement of someone who had run this kind of calculation before. He crossed to the outbuilding panel, mounted beside the utility door, and activated the exterior lights over the storage barn on the opposite side of the property, a row of floods that lit the far end of the yard like midday and made it appear, from the road, as though someone had stepped out in that direction. The two figures paused, conferred in low tones, and redirected toward the barn, and after 4 minutes, the SUV pulled forward along the road and kept going until its taillights disappeared into the white. Evelyn exhaled slowly in the dark hallway and said, almost to herself, that they had found her faster than she had expected, and he asked who they were, and she said she wasn't certain, but that they were not operating on behalf of anyone she was prepared to trust before she understood the full shape of what had happened. She told him then, not everything, but more than the night before, that she was a senior company employee conducting an internal investigation, that she had traveled to Montana specifically to examine something at a company facility, and that she believed the mechanical failure in the valley might not have been entirely accidental. He asked if she meant sabotage. She said she meant she no longer had confidence in her original assumption, which was close enough. He offered to take her to the county sheriff in the morning, a man named Amos Dillard, who had known Caleb for 11 years, and whose loyalties were not purchasable by a phone call from a corporate legal team. Evelyn said that any contact with local law enforcement risked exposing her position to people she hadn't yet verified as trustworthy, and Caleb looked at her steadily and said she could not simultaneously need help and retain total control over how that help was delivered, and the directness of it stopped her mid-sentence. She stood in the hallway for a moment, then reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, withdrew a small unmarked storage device, and placed it on the table between them. She said that if anyone arrived before dawn, the thing they were looking for was not her. It was that. The wind dropped around 4 in the morning, and by 5:30 the sky had shifted from solid black to the particular gray-blue that came just before a mountain sunrise, a light that made the snow look pale as chalk and the peaks above Silver Creek look carved from something older than weather. Caleb was already awake. He slept in intervals by long habit, the reflex of years when a failing generator at 2 in the morning meant a family without heat in January, and he heard the rotors before the lights appeared, a low pulse that grew steadily into the unmistakable chop of a heavy utility aircraft making a direct approach. By the time he reached the front window, the helicopter had crested the east ridge and was descending into the flat field across the fence line with the practiced efficiency of a crew that had done this in exactly these conditions many times before. Black painted, corporate insignia visible on the forward panel, two stylized wings over a clean serif typeface. It settled in the snow 40 yards from his porch without ceremony, and 6 people came out. 4 wore dark coats that communicated private security without requiring any announcement. 1 was in a paramedic vest, and 1 wore a well-cut charcoal suit and moved to the front of the group with the posture of someone who gave orders rather than received them. A man somewhere in his mid-40s with the composed neutrality of a professional trained to manage crises without revealing what he already knew. He stopped at the fence line and called across the field in a voice calibrated to carry without sounding like a shout. "Madam CEO." Evelyn had come to the doorway behind Caleb, the storage device back in her pocket, and she descended the porch steps in the borrowed coat and old sweater as though she had walked out of boardrooms in exactly that condition before. And the security team's posture recalibrated the moment she appeared, not with relief exactly, but with the specific adjustment of people who have been operating in the absence of their principal and can now stand down from one level of alert. The man in the suit introduced himself as Nolan Ashford and turned to Caleb and said the house needed to be swept and any devices belonging to the CEO retrieved. Caleb said no search would happen without his agreement, and his voice was not aggressive, but contained nothing that left room for negotiation. Nolan studied him briefly, and Evelyn said, before either man could continue, that Caleb Rowan had taken her in from a storm without any knowledge of who she was, that the house had already been visited by people working without authorization, and that she would explain fully once they were airborne. She submitted to a brief paramedic assessment and waved it off. Then she turned to Caleb and asked if he would come along to verify what had happened to the aircraft. He said no. She told him the navigation failure involved a system category he had spent 6 years working on during his civilian aviation rescue service. He said no again. She said she needed a technical evaluation from someone outside the company whose conclusions could not be attributed to internal interest, and that the failure was real and the stakes were larger than the company's press operation was prepared to acknowledge. He stood on the porch for a moment, and then stepped down into the snow and walked toward the helicopter, and as he passed the forward panel, he looked through the side glass at the diagnostic display and stopped. The fault timestamp in the navigation log had been overwritten, not corrupted, overwritten by a process requiring deliberate manual input. He put his hand flat against the fuselage and said, quietly but clearly, that helicopter did not fail in the storm. It was interfered with before it ever left the ground. They flew east with the sunrise coming in low and flat over the valley, the storm's aftermath spread below them. The access road invisible under 3 feet of powder, the tree line bent under snow loads, the landscape indifferent in the way landscapes are to everything human beings do inside them. The pilot from the original flight had sheltered in the aircraft overnight and sustained a minor knee injury from a fall on ice, not from the landing itself, which was consistent with a controlled emergency set-down. Caleb ran the diagnostic sequence himself, working through the avionics bay with the unhurried thoroughness of a man for whom the interior of a helicopter was a familiar vocabulary, naming what he found in the measured cadences of a technical briefing. The navigation unit had received a corrupted coordinate set, placing the aircraft 6 miles south of its intended course. a deviation small enough to appear within operational variance at first glance, but large enough, under low visibility storm conditions, to redirect the flight into terrain where a forced landing was the best available option. The system log had been partially purged, not the random data loss from a power surge, but the cleaner absence left by a targeted deletion command. The emergency locator transmitter had been disconnected through a process requiring a physical access code and a deliberate sequence of steps that could not be performed accidentally or confused with routine maintenance. A software update had been pushed to the avionics system 17 minutes before departure, bearing the authentication signature of a technician named Bryce Talbot, who was currently listed as absent from the Montana testing facility without notice. Nolan said Bryce had not been seen since the previous morning. Evelyn asked who had been present when the flight plan was filed as a restricted itinerary, a list kept short by design, because she had already begun to suspect that the internal investigation she was conducting had reached someone who preferred she not arrive. The list contained 5 names: Evelyn herself, Nolan Ashford, Grant Kingsley, Lydia Waverly, and the director of the Montana facility. Caleb watched Nolan's face as Evelyn said this, not the words but the structure of his attention, the slight adjustment in his breathing, the way his gaze tracked to the avionics bay rather than to her. He had spent enough years working alongside people under pressure to know the difference between the tension of someone receiving new information and the tension of someone deciding what to acknowledge. Inside the forward cabin, wedged behind the communications panel in a position inconsistent with any standard equipment configuration, was a device the size of a cigarette pack with a transmitter antenna folded flat against its back, bearing no manufacturer marking and appearing on no equipment manifest. Based on its charge state, Caleb estimated the device had been transmitting during exactly the hours the unidentified SUV had been circling his property, providing a location signal to people who were not the company's official recovery operation. He photographed it and showed the image to Evelyn, and she looked at it for a long time without speaking. The Kingsley testing facility sat at the edge of a plateau 12 miles outside Silver Creek, its perimeter defined by sensor arrays rather than visible fencing, the kind of installation that existed to test things not yet ready to be publicly acknowledged. Grant's video call came while they were in the technical review room, his face appearing on the wall screen with the careful concern of someone who had prepared the expression before dialing. He was 51, silver-haired, deliberate in his delivery, the kind of man who had spent so many decades using the vocabulary of worry that it no longer bore any relationship to the internal state it was meant to describe. He said the board was meeting in 36 hours. And several members were already discussing implications of an unscheduled excursion resulting in crew risk and communication failure, language so precisely non-accusatory that each word was an accusation, and he told Evelyn she needed to return immediately and allow the narrative to be managed before it calcified. She said she would attend the meeting on her own schedule and ended the call. Caleb said he had just watched her uncle spend 3 minutes performing concern without once asking whether she was physically all right, and she said that was the most accurate summary of Grant Kingsley she had heard in years. She placed a consulting agreement on the table in front of him, a document establishing confidentiality, structured disclosure, and compensation, the corporate mechanism for converting a witness into a resource. He slid it back without signing and said he had a policy against agreeing to terms he hadn't been told the purpose of, and when she said the purpose was to protect him, he said he would make his own arrangements. He told her she had a habit of converting every relationship into a contract because a contract was something she could enforce, and that enforcing things was the only form of trust she knew how to practice. The silence that followed was not comfortable. Caleb stepped into the hallway to call his son, and Evelyn stood at the window and listened without meaning to. The unhurried questions about a calculus test, the brief laugh at something Elliot said, the way Caleb said, "Take care of yourself," like it was a complete sentence requiring nothing after it. And she understood then what she had observed, and not yet named, that he always made space for the person in front of him, even in the middle of a situation with no clean edges. Lydia Waverly knocked and entered without waiting, and said she had found something requiring immediate attention. Evelyn's digital signature appeared on the authorization log for the update that had disabled the navigation system, timestamped at a moment when Evelyn had been standing before 400 people at a charitable foundation event with no access to the company's internal network. Lydia spread the records across the table with the systematic attention of someone who had been building this case since pulling the first file, laying each document beside the one that contradicted it, the way a careful attorney arranges evidence. Not for effect, but for completeness, because the chain had to hold under scrutiny. The authentication log showed a keystroke cadence consistent with a human user rather than an automated process, which meant someone had accessed the system using a credential set that replicated Evelyn's authorization profile. Not a simple password theft, but a deliberate reproduction of her digital identity, requiring either administrative-level access to the security architecture or intimate knowledge of how it had been designed. The only individual whose security role permitted restoration of backup credential keys was Nolan Ashford, which placed him, for the second time in 24 hours, in a position requiring a credible explanation. Nolan submitted his personal devices without being asked, and the forensic sweep returned results that complicated rather than resolved the picture. His account credentials had been used to access the backup key system from a workstation inside the Montana facility, but the corridor camera covering that wing had suffered a 17-minute gap in its recording, beginning 9 minutes before the access event. Not a power interruption, not a system reboot, but a static frame inserted manually into the recording buffer. Caleb asked to see the physical workstation. In the access panel beneath the desk, he found a rectangular dust impression consistent with a mobile computing device that had been placed there, connected to the network port, and removed, the connection window matching the timestamp of the unauthorized credential use. Someone had sat in that room, used Nolan's identity to authorize a falsified update, and walked out before any monitoring system logged a departure. Sheriff Amos Dillard arrived mid-afternoon to secure the workstation, bringing the particular unhurried confidence of someone who had been dealing with things requiring actual resolution for a long time. He said Bryce Talbot had rented a cabin near Silver Creek under a false name 4 days before the flight, paid in cash, and that the rental was currently vacant. He and Caleb drove out together. Bryce was gone, but not long gone. A coffee mug still held warmth. Left behind were a prepaid phone, a copy of a testing report with specific passages marked in red, an unused bus ticket, and a handwritten letter addressed to Evelyn Kingsley by name. In it, Bryce wrote that he had been told the software modification would produce a navigation error forcing the aircraft to return to its departure point. That he had not known the emergency locator would be separately disabled. That he had not understood the weather forecast was wrong by a margin that would place the crew in genuine danger, and that he was sorry in the way people are sorry when they have done something they cannot undo. He named the person who had given him the instruction, not Grant directly, but Grant's executive assistant, a man named Dale Reeves, operating through a company name Bryce had never heard of. The prepaid phone vibrated once while Caleb still held it. If she survived, make sure the board sees her as unstable. They drove back to the facility in the first 10 minutes without speaking. And then Caleb said what they were both thinking. The goal had never been to kill her. Grant Kingsley was not someone who committed to the permanent solution when a temporary one served the same purpose. He was a person who had spent decades operating inside the architecture of institutional power, where the instruments of control were procedural rather than physical, and where the permanent removal of a person created problems orders of magnitude larger than the ones it solved. What he had wanted was simpler and, from his perspective, more durable. Evelyn, absent from a board meeting, discredited by the circumstances of that absence, positioned as a CEO who had concealed a product safety issue while conducting an unauthorized trip, and the board presented with cause to award temporary executive authority to someone whose loyalty was not in question, meaning Grant. The weather had converted a calibrated disruption into a genuine emergency, and the fact that she was alive and in possession of the storage device was the specific part of the plan that had failed to work as intended. Caleb proposed that they not disclose the discovery of the prepaid phone, but use it operationally, sending a message from Bryce's number to Dale Reeves, indicating that the storage device was still hidden at Caleb's house, with enough specific detail to be credible, distributed only after Nolan had verified which members of the Kingsley organization had access to Bryce's contact information. If the SUV returned, they would know which channel the message had traveled through. Evelyn asked why he was willing to use his own property as bait, and he said the house had become a target the moment she walked through the gate. It was already inside the picture, and choosing how to use that fact was more productive than pretending otherwise. He arranged for Elliot to stay on campus for another 48 hours, without explaining why, his son asking no questions because 17 years of knowing his father had taught him that when Caleb said stay put, it was not a suggestion. Evelyn said she felt responsible for what she had brought to his address. He said she had not asked him to open the door, and he hadn't done it expecting things to be uncomplicated, and the conversation about responsibility could happen after the relevant parties were accounted for. She told him she had not slept without one ear open in years, had not relaxed in any building without first identifying exits, had not accepted a kindness without calculating what it would eventually cost her, and she said this not as complaint but as condition, the way a person describes a chronic injury they have stopped expecting to fully heal. Caleb said that at his house she had slept, because there was no one in that building who needed anything from her, and that the absence had been sufficient. Neither of them spoke after that. The property monitoring feed on Caleb's phone showed the county road at 10:17, and on it, moving without headlights until 50 yards past the tree line, was a dark SUV with no plate illuminated. Sheriff Amos had positioned 2 deputies in unmarked vehicles along the access road, and a third behind the storage barn with a clear sight line to the front of the house. All 3 briefed with the economy of instruction that Amos used when a situation required people to do exactly one thing and do it correctly on the first attempt. The SUV sat on the road for 4 minutes, engine running, and then 2 men in contractor-cut coats walked up the drive and knocked on Caleb's front door with the unhurried manner of people who believed they had both time and standing. They presented printed paperwork identifying themselves as representatives of a Kingsley Aeronautics Asset Recovery Team, citing authorization to retrieve proprietary company equipment from the premises, and the paperwork carried a Kingsley letterhead and looked, at distance and in poor light, convincing enough to work on someone who had no reason to examine it closely. Caleb asked for the authorization order number and the name of the approving executive, and the two men looked at each other briefly and provided neither, which was the only answer required. Nolan and a state investigator came around the side of the barn inside 30 seconds, and the men were held on the porch while their vehicle was searched. What the search produced built the case in layers. A signal jamming unit of the type used to suppress emergency locators, aerial photographs of Caleb's property taken from drone altitude, printed copies of Evelyn's restricted flight itinerary, a directory of Montana facility employee phone numbers, and a payment authorization slip from a company called North Star Strategic Holdings, bearing no address and no signatory beyond an account reference. One of the two men said he had been contracted through a private security brokerage, that the arrangement had come through Dale Reeves, that his job was recovery of a storage device, and that he would not have taken the contract if he had understood the full situation. A claim that was possibly true and changed nothing about the payment trail. Lydia cross-referenced North Star Strategic Holdings against corporate registration databases and returned with a result predictable in its logic. The company was managed by a registered agent whose history included 3 years as personal assistant to a member of the Kingsley board. The entity had been incorporated 22 months earlier. 6 months after Evelyn had opened the internal investigation Grant had apparently learned about, and had received 9 wire transfers from a subsidiary of a fund Grant had structured in the late 1990s and never formally divested. Grant, reached by his own counsel, issued a statement through a spokesperson confirming he had no knowledge of North Star's activities and calling for an independent review, and simultaneously filed a formal motion with the board secretary, requesting an emergency session to address the CEO's handling of the incident. He was moving to hold the vote before she reached the building. The flight from Montana to the main Kingsley Aeronautics headquarters took 2 hours and 40 minutes in the same aircraft that had found her, every navigation system manually verified by Caleb before departure and cleared by Nolan in writing before the rotors turned. Evelyn watched him work through the departure, check with the focused thoroughness of someone for whom the difference between adequate and correct was not a philosophical distinction, and asked at altitude whether flying in this specific aircraft bothered him. He said machines that had been properly checked were the ones he trusted most, because at least you knew what they had been through. It was the machines that had been tested and the results buried that made him refuse. She filed it in the category of things that applied to considerably more than helicopters. The city appeared in the late afternoon, Kingsley Tower standing in the financial district with the verticality of a building designed to be recognized from a distance. News crews were positioned outside the main entrance. Grant had made his call to the press before dawn, and the story being circulated was the one constructed in Evelyn's absence. The reckless executive, the crew placed in danger, the CEO who had concealed a safety problem. Lydia had identified 3 separately sourced stories containing identical language, the kind of coordination that required a central source and a prepared timeline. She advised Evelyn to go directly to the board session rather than engage with the press, on the basis that anything said publicly before the evidentiary record was established would be characterized as preemptive spin. They landed on the roof and descended to the executive floor, and Caleb noticed technicians in the server room, working with the focused efficiency of people racing a deadline, running commands in file management windows rather than monitoring interfaces. He told Evelyn in 4 words, "They are deleting data." Nolan invoked an administrative hold on all server-side write operations, and the technician in charge said he had received a maintenance authorization from the board chairman's office, timestamped 11 minutes after the emergency session motion had been filed. Grant had decided to trim the evidentiary record in the interval between calling the vote and the vote taking place. Evelyn said the board chairman was a man who had been Grant's law school classmate and his neighbor for 19 years, and she said it in the tone of someone who had finished a long calculation and arrived at exactly the answer she had feared. Then she straightened her coat, picked up the storage device, and walked toward the conference room. Grant had arrived first, which was consistent with everything Caleb now understood about him. A man who had learned that the table you arrived at first was the table you set, and that the structure of a meeting was itself an argument before a single word had been spoken. He sat at the far end of the conference room, with the composed confidence of someone who believed the visible facts supported his position, and they did, at the surface level he had constructed: an unscheduled flight, a crew placed in emergency conditions, a CEO dark for multiple hours, and located at a private residence with an individual holding no clearance, proprietary devices potentially exposed to an outside party, and that same individual subsequently transported into a restricted testing facility. He presented this sequence in the deliberate, regretful tone of a man who would have preferred things to be otherwise, and said the company required stability, that the defense contract review demanded confidence at the executive level, and that the board had both the authority and the obligation to assign temporary executive control to the vice chairman while a full review was conducted. Evelyn let him finish. She did not interrupt, did not display anything on her face that he could use, and when he stopped, she began. She walked through the navigation log modification, the falsified update bearing her forged credentials, the manual disabling of the emergency locator, the tracking device placed inside the aircraft, the message sent to Bryce Talbot, instructing someone to ensure she appeared unstable if she survived, the North Star payment chain, the server deletion order authorized in the 11-minute window between the emergency vote filing and this meeting, and the forensic connection between the dormant code in the falsified update and a proprietary development project Grant had solely overseen 8 years prior. She presented each item with the calm of someone who had spent the intervening hours not sleeping but preparing, and she presented Caleb's technical analysis as an independent evaluation by a certified aviation systems technician, credentials Grant had apparently not thought to investigate before dismissing him as a local repairman. Grant said the evidence pointed to subordinate misconduct rather than any direction he had given. Caleb, invited to address the technical elements directly, said that the code fragment in the falsified update was sourced from a proprietary development environment used on exactly one internal project, a navigation optimization program that Grant had personally overseen 8 years prior, discontinued without public documentation, its existence known only to people with direct access to its development archive. That code had never appeared in any public release, any open-source repository, or any shared system beyond the closed environment where it had been written, meaning its presence in the sabotage package was inconsistent with a low-level technician acting alone. Grant said He was not responsible for how former project assets might be used by individuals who had worked under him years earlier. Caleb said he understood that was the preferred framing and left it there. Nolan announced that Bryce Talbot had agreed to provide a formal statement confirming that Dale Reeves had given him the specific installation instructions and referenced Grant's authority when Bryce expressed hesitation, and that Bryce had not been told the emergency locator would be separately disabled, and that when he had discovered this, he had sent the unsigned warning message to Evelyn's phone. Grant said Bryce's account was the statement of a man minimizing his own criminal exposure, and then said in a voice that had lost the careful calibration of the previous hour that Evelyn's claim to lead this company could not rest on the testimony of a technician and the judgment of a generator repairman from a small mountain town. Evelyn said, "The company's safety record does not rest on who I know or where I spent a night. It rests on whether the people responsible for it tell the truth about what failed. The man from that mountain town told the truth when he had no reason to and no reward for doing so. That is the only standard I intend to hold this company to." The board voted. It was not unanimous, but it was sufficient. Grant was suspended within 48 hours by a 3-part resolution covering fraud, safety interference, and obstruction of the data preservation order, and the corporate announcement was written by Lydia in the careful, legally precise language of someone who had spent the previous week deciding which version of her professional obligation she was going to honor. The vote to retain Evelyn had carried by a 2-member margin. Not comfortable, but, as Lydia pointed out, a majority, and the oversight conditions attached to it were the kind a person who had just had her navigation system deliberately sabotaged could accept without finding unreasonable. 3 board members indicated, in the careful language of people who wanted to be on record without being on record, that the safety incident should be managed quietly to protect the defense contract. Evelyn told them she intended to do the opposite. The disclosure went to the regulatory authority first and the press second, describing the safety failure, the nature of the interference, and the corrective response. Suspension of the navigation system pending complete redesign, audit of all testing data from the previous 2 years, a new independent safety advisory structure reporting outside the family chain of control, and a formal whistleblower protection mechanism her general counsel was prohibited from unilaterally amending. The stock price dropped 7% across 3 days. A financial commentator described the disclosure as evidence of poor crisis management. Evelyn read the commentary and did not change her position. She had grown up inside a company that treated its failures the way a certain kind of family treats its embarrassments, with silence, selective memory, and sustained social pressure applied until the people who witnessed the failure stopped mentioning it. She had decided somewhere between a wood stove in Silver Creek and a board table in this building that she was no longer willing to manage a company that way. Grant's formal removal came 60 days later, accompanied by a federal referral on fraud and obstruction. Bryce cooperated fully and was retained in a limited capacity during the safety audit, not as a reward, but because he knew the system best, and because Evelyn believed that people coerced into doing wrong who chose transparency afterward deserved a different outcome than people who had planned the wrong in advance. She offered Caleb the position of Director of Flight Safety. He thanked her and said no. He said he was not moving to a city, was not becoming a title on an organizational chart, and was not prepared to have his technical conclusions filtered through a legal communications department. Evelyn said she understood. He said that was convenient, because he had 4 conditions for the consulting arrangement he was prepared to offer. His reports would go directly to the Independent Safety Committee with no intermediate review. His findings could not be edited or recharacterized by company communications. Any employee raising a safety concern through the new reporting channel had the right to decline an unsafe assignment without employment consequence. And every incident was to be disclosed on identical timelines to regulators and internal staff, without sequencing designed to manage the narrative. Evelyn said those were not conditions she needed to negotiate, and signed the arrangement with Amos Dillard as witness, because Caleb had specified a public official and she had not argued the point. She returned the green sweater when they were alone, folding it with a care that was more than the garment required, and set it on the table between them. He told her she could keep it. It had sat in the dresser for 3 years without being touched, and there was no practical reason to maintain possession of something useful only in the abstract. She said she didn't want to take something that carried that much history, that it didn't feel like hers to carry forward. He said that holding on to a thing was not always the same as honoring the person it came from, and that sometimes the continued holding was less about respect for the past, and more about fear of the open space that would appear if the holding stopped. She set the sweater on the chair between them and left the decision where it lived, with him, and he understood that this was the most careful thing she could have done, and the most honest. She had not resolved the question for him. She had only refused to use her own discomfort as a reason to make the choice herself. She asked him, looking at the chair rather than at him, whether he had thought she was dangerous when she had first appeared at his gate. He said he had, yes, in the honest and unelaborated way of someone who sees no reason to soften a true answer. She asked why he had opened the door anyway. He said she was cold, and the cold was a problem that could be addressed, and that the remaining questions about who she was and what she was carrying could reasonably wait until morning. She said she had not understood until that moment that his kindness had not been a technique for approaching her. It had simply been the way he was made. Outside, the snow had started again, softly this time, without urgency. 6 months later, the independent audit had produced its final report. The navigation system had been fully redesigned under Direct Safety Committee oversight, and 7 employees, who had filed internal complaints in the previous 3 years and been subsequently sidelined, had been offered reinstatement at their original grade, with back pay, without additional confidentiality agreements attached as a condition of return. Grant's case had been referred to a federal grand jury, his attorneys managing the timeline with the expensive patience of people whose job was to ensure that nothing happened quickly. Caleb was in Silver Creek doing what he had always done, driving the switchback roads before dawn, keeping the machines alive, submitting technical reports on the 3rd of each month to a committee that read them and acted on them, which was, as far as he was concerned, the entire point. Elliot was home for a school break, a lanky 17-year-old with his father's pragmatism and his late mother's capacity for noticing things before choosing whether to mention them. He said over dinner one evening that his father seemed less like someone waiting for something, and more like someone who had recently arrived somewhere, and Caleb said that was an accurate observation and moved on. On a Sunday morning, the helicopter came again. Its approach so familiar now that Caleb recognized the engine signature before the sound resolved, stepping onto the porch with his coffee and watching it settle into the snow-covered field. One person stepped out. No security team, no attorneys, no paramedic, just Evelyn in a plain coat, carrying a bag small enough to suggest she had not planned to stay long, or had decided in advance she did not need much. She walked to the fence and stopped. He asked if the aircraft was giving her trouble. She said it was operating exactly as specified. He asked what had brought her out on a Sunday. She said she had wanted to take a trip with no agenda items attached to it, no board calls, no contracts, no meetings scheduled on the other end, and that this was the only place she had thought of where that would be possible without someone eventually finding a reason to interrupt it. She asked if she could stay the night. He asked if she had brought anything toward the cost. She said she had prepared for that possibility this time. He said the rate was what it had always been. She looked at the house from the gate, the way people look at a place that has meant something in a way they haven't yet found words for, crossed the yard, and came up the steps to stand on the porch, where she had first descended from the black aircraft 6 months before, squinting into the rotor wash of a machine that had arrived to reclaim her. None of that was visible on her face now except as its absence. The pilot lifted the aircraft and banked east toward the range, and the sound faded into the particular silence of a Montana morning after snowfall. He opened the door, not because she was the CEO of a company whose helicopter had twice settled in his field, but because the woman in front of him was not a stranger running from something anymore. She was someone who had chosen to come back. Some things did not require language to be understood. Some doors opened not as transactions but as answers to questions that had been sitting quietly in a house for longer than either person had known.